If you're interested in the Goddess Babalon and how her representation has evolved across history, and in the role of the feminine and femininity in Thelema, as well as in the role of the Scarlett Woman, stay tuned, because you're just about to find out. Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Angela Puca and welcome to my symposium. I'm a PhD and a university lecturer, and this is your online resource for the academic study of Magick, Esotericism, shamanism, paganism, Thelema, and all things occult. Today I have a very special guest here on the channel, which I'm very excited to introduce to you, and her name is Dr. Manon Hedenborg White. She is a senior lecturer in religious studies at Karlstad University and obtained her PhD in history of religions at Uppsala University. Her doctoral dissertation, The Eloquent Blood, the Goddess Babalon and the Construction of Femininities in Western Esotericism, was published by Oxford University Press last year. This is a fantastic book that I highly recommend and will leave the link in the info box. In the past 2 years, she was funded by the Swedish Research Council as a postdoctoral fellow at Södertörn University and was also a guest researcher at the Center for a History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents at the University of Amsterdam. Her postdoctoral project explored the roles of women in Aleister Crowley's religion of Thelema. So, are you excited yet? This is going to be a fantastic interview, so please help me in welcoming Dr. Manon Hedenborg White. Hello, Manon. How are you today?
Hello, Angela. I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm super excited to have you here. Thank you so much for accepting to be on the symposium.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
I already mentioned in the intro your fantastic book, which, by the way, I really like the title, The Eloquent Blood. It's very graphic, but to me it's like in a good way.
Thank you.
Graphic titles, that sort of instill a certain emotion tend to stick better with you.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, I like the title as well. To me, it just kind of, when I was digging around for something and I was reading bits of poetry and various pieces of writing, and it just kind of sprung out at me, and I was just sort of like, yes, that works. Okay, what can we do with this? So yeah, thank you for saying so.
So I guess then my first question will be on the Goddess Babalon. Her role in history and how that changed over time, and her role in Western Esotericism.
Yeah. So obviously, of course, big question. Lots of different parts to this answer potentially, but to put it like quite simply, Babalon is a goddess and one of the most important deities within the religion Thelema, which of course was founded by the British occultist Aleister Crowley in 1904. Crowley came out of a dispensationalist evangelical background, so he studied the Book of Revelation from a very young age, and Babalon is quite strongly inspired by Crowley's favorable sort of reinterpretation or counter reading, one might say, of the biblical Whore of Babylon. So in the Book of Revelation, of course, the Whore of Babylon is this antagonistic figure. She is this majestic, drunken, libidinous woman riding astride the beast. But in Crowley's rendering, she is, of course, a positive figure and a soteriological figure, and she represents, in essence, the magical formula of passionate union with all aspects of existence. And more simply put, she's also a sort of embodiment of the sacredness of the liberated sexual impulse, and perhaps especially the feminine or the female liberated sexual impulse, one might say. So yes, but so Babalon first And I want to say just something very briefly about kind of my approach to this topic as well, and about methodological agnosticism in this vein also. So when I'm lecturing about this topic, I get a lot of questions like, is Babylon, is there a concordance between Babylon and Lilith, or are Babylon and Kali the same entity, or are Babylon and Inanna or Ishtar or Astarte, or these various goddesses or spirits or angelic or demonic or chthonic feminine figures from across the world that seem to have in common this kind of connection between sex and death and aggression and power and female power and all these things. Like, are they the same entity? I get that question a lot. And I think that's perfectly valid. That's a perfectly valid question to ask from an emic point of view, so from the point of view of insider belief and practice. But of course, the way that I'm looking at this is in this very dry, boring, historical way, which is we're not looking for whether or not these are the same entities, but we're looking for actual documentable, verifiable chains of historical transmission. So the way that I'm looking at this figure is as a conceptualization of a goddess under that specific name. And in that form, the story of Babylon starts kind of properly with Aleister Crowley, even though Crowley, of course, drew on a lot of older sources. So, but like from my historical point of view, that's the way that story is going to be told. So Crowley's first vision of Babylon or experience magically with Babylon was really in 1909. So she doesn't appear in the Book of the Law from 1904. There's a reference to the figure of the Scarlet Woman, which is related, and I know we're going to get back to that. And there's also the goddess that does appear in the Book of the Law is the goddess Nuit, who represents the totality of existence and the night sky, and who is the sort of main character or the speaker of the first chapter of the Book of the Law. And there's a brief reference to Nuit having a secret name or a hidden name, and Crowley later came to identify that name as Babylon. And that's based on an experience that he had in 1904 when he was traversing the desert of Algeria with his current lover and magical disciple, the poet Victor B. Neuburg. And they were exploring the Enochian magical system, or the system of the ethers, which were so the Enochian magical system, of course, which was developed by John Dee and Edward Kelly during the Elizabethan age. And Crowley and Neuburg were intending to scry all of the ethers one by one. And so one night, Crowley entered into the 12th ether, and he sees this vision of a great woman astride a great beast. And he realizes that this is Babylon. This is Babylon the Great, basically. And he later changes the spelling of her name from the biblical or like the conventional Babylon to the Babalon that has become the canonical Thelemic spelling. But Crowley, during this time, he was undergoing this magical ordeal, which is one of the penultimate stages in his magical system, and which he refers to as the crossing of the abyss. So having climbed up the tree of life, and this is Crowley's magical system as structured within his magical order AA, which held kind of a Golden Dawn based structure up to a certain with Crowley's own flair added to it. So after like building and developing the self, the adept arrives at a point where they have to traverse this terrifying void, which is the abyss, which separates the manifest from the numinous, or on the tree of life, separates the three topmost Sephiroth, Kether, Chokhmah, and Binah, from the lower seven. And in order to do so, Crowley believed the adept had to utterly annihilate their individuality, totally kill and sacrifice their ego, and become completely receptive to all of existence. And only by doing so could that person kind of die and be reborn on the other side. And Babalon is very strongly linked to this process. So Crowley talks about draining your blood into Babalon's cup and being reborn through her womb. But he also, so he describes this as a kind of a sort of mystical death and rebirth, but he also describes it in sexual terms, in terms of, and I think I'm paraphrasing, or I might be quoting directly, but an ecstasy in which there is no trace of pain, like the giving up of the self to the beloved. Is how he writes about it as well. So in that sense, Babalon, the very strongly sexual components of that, of her as a symbol and as a figure, are also related to this idea of complete surrender of the self. So that's really where Crowley's idea of Babalon as a goddess starts to take form in 1909. And he, of course, wrote lots more about this figure. And he, of course, wrote lots more in terms of the idea of the Scarlet Woman as well. One of the ideas that he understands the Scarlet Woman, but we'll get back to this, is as the earthly avatar or embodiment of the goddess Babalon. But yes, so long monologue here, and this takes us up to the point of Crowley, basically. But of course, Babalon has gone beyond Crowley, we might say. So one of the really important people in the 20th century history of Babalon was Crowley's disciple, John Whiteside Parsons, who was one of the earliest adopters of Thelema in the United States, who joined the Agape Lodge of Ordo Templi Orientis in the early 1940s, but who quite quickly developed a sort of experimental take on magic, which was very much in line with his personality. He was, of course, one of the pioneers of rocket science as well. And he started in 1946 doing a series of rituals which were aimed at producing the earthly manifestation of the goddess Babalon. And as many of the viewers will know as well, he was very famously aided in this endeavor by L. Ron Hubbard, the future founder of Dianetics and Scientology, and also by Marjorie Cameron, who was Parsons' lover, and they would later get married, but also an illustrator and an artist. So they were trying to produce the earthly incarnation of Babalon, and Parsons had his own, kind of added his own interpretation of this figure as well, which was much more kind of socio-politically oriented. So this was in the era of kind of post World War II, but early Cold War days, and the emerging era of McCarthyism, and increasing social control in various areas, or what Parsons perceived as such anyway. So he saw Babalon as kind of this very warrior-like, revolutionary feminine messiah who would descend to earth and liberate all of humanity, and would liberate women who would then help to liberate all of humanity and bring about this age of Dionysian freedom and love and social justice and all of these things. And so he kind of brought his own flair to this idea, a more sort of concrete figure in a lot of ways. He also touched on the crossing of the abyss stuff, definitely, but he emphasizes a more kind of anthropomorphic figure in some ways, who's going to descend to earth and kind of fix society in a lot of different ways. But he also envisioned Babalon partly as kind of a force or an idea or like a symbol for a kind of energy that could also be incarnate in anyone, regardless of gender, and which is kind of linked to this sort of rebellion against oppressive authorities and sexual freedom and all of these things. So the third person who's written a lot about this figure in like the kind of in the 20th century is, of course, Kenneth Grant, who was So moving back to Britain, who was an occultist as well, of course, and who was Crowley's secretary very late in Crowley's life, and who was initiated into the 9th degree of Crowley's OTO, but who was also an initiate of Indian left-hand path Tantra, so what Grant refers to as the Varma Marg, and who... So Kenneth Grant had this idea of a primordial religious tradition, or a mystical tradition that he believed to have originated in prehistoric times in Central Africa, but which then migrated to Egypt, and which was characterized by a sort of stellar lunar cult of the what he referred to as the goddess Typhon and her bastard son Set, and which Grant believed centered on the veneration of the female sexual organs and of female genital fluids. And he then believed that this what he called the Typhonian tradition, or the Typhonian cult, was driven underground by solar worshippers, and then kind of flourished in the tantric traditions of South Asia and Southeast Asia. And Grant saw Thelema as kind of a tantra for the West, and as kind of an iteration of this very ancient primordial cult as well. But he believed that Crowley got one thing very fundamentally wrong about sexual worship, because Grant saw the left-hand path of Tantra as being characterized by the deliberate use of trained female sexual priestesses. And of course, Crowley also, like a fundamental portion of Crowley's magical practice and teachings, was the practice of sexual magic. But in Crowley's kind of version of sexual magic, the masculine genital fluids, or the semen, play a very important role. And Crowley, in several of his most important sex magical writings, kind of identifies the semen with the directing magical will that fuels a magical operation. And Grant basically says that Crowley got this wrong, and it's not the male partner, it's actually the female sex magical partner. And he uses the term Babalon to refer variously to the trained female sex magical priestess, but also to the divine feminine force, which is kind of at the root of everything, in which Grant sees Babalon, or the Scarlet Woman, as he also calls her, as or the priestess, as kind of an incarnation of her. So that's interesting, and that's something that I think that, and I say this a lot, but I don't think it gets said enough. Grant was actually quite early, or one of the earliest people to formulate this sort of explicit critique of male centrism in Crowley's system of sexual magic. And he wasn't doing it from like a feminist point of view, or what we'd see as a feminist point of view today necessarily, but I think it's interesting that it was happening at the same time as when Kenneth Grant wrote his books on the Typhonian tradition, and the 9 so-called Typhonian trilogies, the first of which comes out in the early 1970s. That's like when everything is happening kind of with the second wave of feminism. So I think that's interesting, even if Grant wasn't drawing explicitly on those second wave ideas. It's kind of at the same time as that is happening, and as also kind of feminist witchcraft or feminist Wicca is kind of emerging as well. So that's interesting. And yes, but this has, of course, continued, and these ideas have continued to kind of spread. And in the occult milieu of the last few decades, one thing that is really important, and has been really important to the way that Babalon is understood, is that there has been like an increasing proliferation of women as writers on occult topics, and also within Thelema, and also specifically on the goddess Babalon. So from starting in the early 1990s, we have a number of texts that have come out which have been authored by women or queer practitioners, and which have been really important in rephrasing this this symbol in various ways today. So what we see today, and this is within Thelema, kind of within Thelema proper, but the symbol of Babylon, or the figure of Babylon, has also very much been taken kind of outside of Orthodox Thelema into like a broader kind of esoteric or occult landscape. So we see kind of the what Crowley wrote, kind of rubbing shoulders with interpretations which draw quite heavily on feminist thinking or queer feminist thinking, and quite a lot of contemporary interpretations of Babylon which link her very strongly to the idea of female liberation or LGBTQ liberation, of sexual minorities, or like non-normative sexual practices, or things like sex work, and seeing these people seeing Babylon as kind of being a champion of all of these things. So long answer to that question. But what I think is interesting, just to put it all in a nutshell, is that Babylon, if we are to trace her history and her place in contemporary esotericism, is that we have an example here of a figure who originates very much as a negative stereotype within the Book of Revelations in the Bible, as this very demonized sort of figure. And whether or not it's the same figure, this kind of, I don't want to say archetype, because that has a lot of connotations that I don't necessarily want to bring into this, but kind of, that keeps coming back over the last 2,000 years, which is kind of the bad girl, or the slut, or the whore, or the harlot, or the temptress, and who comes back kind of as a femme fatale in the Victorian era, for instance, and which within Thelema gets inverted and transformed into this very positive symbol of completely shameless, unabashed feminine sexual desire and lust and passion and empowerment and all of these things. And in the contemporary period gets even transformed in some iterations into a sort of feminist symbol. So I think that's interesting.
Mm. Yes, very much so. And how come Babylon specifically has been considered, the symbol of all of these feminine elements and aspects?
That's a good question. I think there is, the history of Babylon as an idea, kind of starting with Crowley's sort of inversion of this negative figure from the Bible. It parallels with that of other figures as well. So like what's happened to the idea of the witch, for instance, in the last 100 years, maybe, which of course has been this very loaded negative figure in the public imagination as well, but was reclaimed and embraced and kind of taken up as a symbol of resistance. It also parallels with, of course, like the development of modern Satanism, although those are very distinct traditions, but still there's like an overlap in the way that these kind of figures are taken up. So I think that's one instance of it. And of course, like the history of the word queer as an identity, for instance, like there's something... I think that if you want to kind of express that you're against the prevailing order in some way, a very powerful way of doing so, and a very successful way of doing so a lot of the time, is taking something that the prevailing order says is evil, and then being like, I'm going to embrace this, and I'm going to say that this is good, and I'm going to put this on a pedestal and in a place of sacredness instead. So that's very... I think that's a very powerful form of kind of
empowering,
kind of symbolic resistance. Of course, that's a very sort of I don't know, sociological, anthropological way of answering that question. Like, of course, there are other possible responses to that question as well. I think another issue, which I think is really kind of doesn't get said enough as well, is that like during Crowley's early years and his life, so kind of the Victorian Edwardian period, like there really, especially kind of around the fin de siècle, there really weren't very many kind of positive images of female sexual power during that time. You either had kind of the femme fatale images, which were largely kind of
a cautionary tale sometimes.
Yes, exactly.
She always ends up.
Yes, usually they meet sticky ends, and although they kind of were empowered figures, some of them, they were like written or painted a lot of the time from like a slightly or majorly misogynistic viewpoint. So that was like a negative idea. And even within like the first wave of feminism, first wave feminists tend to take a quite pessimistic outlook on sexuality as well, and were more concerned with kind of protecting women from the dangers connected to sexuality, which was really important during that time as well, with sexually transmitted diseases, with raising the age of consent, and fighting for sex workers' rights during that time as well. But also, like, that kind of early first wave of feminism also wasn't hugely concerned with women's right to kind of say yes to sexual desire and sexual pleasure. So having that sort of imagery at that time, that was quite rare and quite radical to have, like not only an image of like, because when like most of the people who were kind of more sex positive within kind of the early first wave of feminism were kind of like, the extent that they'd go to was sort of, you know, if it's marital, if it's monogamous, if it's reproductively oriented, if it's heterosexual, then it's okay. It might even be good. But to have someone saying that, you know, in fact, all of the transgressive, all of the anti-normative things are not only fine and acceptable, but they're actually sacred, and that, like, for a woman to be promiscuous or to be non-monogamous or to be engaged in sex just for the mere pleasure of it, that was very radical at that time. So I think that's quite a powerful idea as well, and I think it still is in a lot of ways. Obviously, like, a lot has changed, and people today, or people who identify as women or as femme today, face very different kind of social mores than did women at the beginning of the 20th century. But I think in a lot of ways that idea is still relevant and more radical today than one might think.
Mm. Yeah, that's very interesting, and I really liked your your answer and your explanation of how reclaiming a derogatory term or a term associated with something considered to be evil is a way of reclaiming and also contrasting the dominant system. And that also happens with paganism. Paganism also started out as, you know, paganism started out as a derogatory term, and in that case as well, you do have a progressive reclamation of that term as being sacred. So it's fascinating to me how something considered, you know, evil or transgressive or forbidden can be elevated to the status of sacredness. There is a very interesting, you know, evolution that you see in Western Esotericism, perhaps not just with Babalon, but with other things as well.
Yeah, no, I think so. Definitely. It has a lot of different parallels, and also just kind of inverting. One of the things I think is really interesting as well. Lots of things are interesting. But like one of the ways that I got into researching this topic was that when I was an undergraduate, I took a course on religion and sexuality, and I got to write a paper for that. And the paper that I wrote was I'd quite recently sort of stumbled into studying esotericism, but this was within history of religions. And the paper that I wrote for that was a comparison of the Virgin Mary and the Goddess Babalon as different kind of images of femininity. And that paper's not available anywhere, for which we should all be very grateful, I think, because I'm sure it wasn't very good. But I think that sort of idea has kind of stuck with me as well, because I think that's interesting, just this idea of like the Madonna whore dichotomy, or this sort of binarization of femininity, and how a lot of the time was like it's the Madonna who is seen as like the good girl, and it's the whore who's the bad girl, and what happens in Thelema is that really like the bad girl gets not redeemed, not turned into a good girl, but like embraced, basically. And that is interesting, I think, and radical in a lot of ways.
Yeah, definitely. And what about the element of the feminine and the understanding and perception of femininity in Thelema, the religion of Thelema?
Yeah. So yeah, big question as well. So of course, like one of the things that are really important are so in Liber Alva Legis, or in the Book of the Law, which, as I've said, Crowley penned in 1904 and is like the foundational sacred text of Thelema. That text is divided into 3 chapters, as I've mentioned, and the who are like kind of spoken or narrated by 3 separate divine entities. And the speaker of the first chapter is the goddess Nuit. So she's feminine, and she is kind of within like the core sort of Thelemic pantheon. She is kind of the utmost, the highest manifestation of the feminine divine. And then there's the second chapter, which is spoken by the god Hadit, who is kind of the lover and masculine polarity, who kind of unites with Nuit. So in that polarity, Nuit represents the totality of experience and everything that is kind of external to us, and everything that as we go through life and we experience it, that we seek to unite with. And Hadit is kind of that infinitely condensed core or life force of each person that seeks union with Nuit. And the symbol of that union, or the product of that union as it's conceptualized in the Book of the Law, is the god Ra-Hor Kuit, who is a form of the god Horus, and who is kind of described as male, but also really androgynous in a lot of Crowley's reasoning around that figure. So one important thing there is, I think, that like the goddess Nuit is kind of, in one way, arguably kind of the uttermost representation of the divine that is external to the individual within Thelema. So like the divine feminine is tremendously important. And of course, Babalon, as I've said, Crowley interpreted this reference to Nuit's secret or hidden name in the Book of the Law as a reference to Babalon. So we might say that Babalon is kind of the earthly sexual representation of Babalon, of Nuit, or kind of the representation of the divine feminine for this particular aeon that Crowley believed started with the reception of the Book of the Law, and which he refers to as the Aeon of Horus. So the divine feminine is kind of very hugely important in Crowley's kind of explication of Thelema. And I think it's also important to say that it's like there's been quite a lot of research on the occultism of the fin de siècle, and especially in England, of women being really formative to movements like Theosophy or spiritualism, also in North America, or or to the Golden Dawn, for instance. And I think that that also holds true of the magical orders that Crowley founded or was involved in. So the AA, which he founded or co-founded in 1907, and also, of course, Ordo Templi Orientis, or the OTO, which Crowley became involved in properly in 1912. And women have always been important to those magical orders, which are still around today, of course, and which I believe we'll get back to as well. So, for instance, during Crowley's lifetime, one of his love magical partners, Laila Waddell, was the Grand Secretary General of OTO for Britain, one of Crowley's other lovers, and also one of his Scarlet Women was the Grand Secretary General of OTO in the 1920s. She was also the Premonstratrix, one of the 3 governing positions in Crowley's AA. There were also people like Crowley's student and very, very long-term friend, Jane Wolfe, who studied with him in Europe in the 1920s and went back to North America in the late 1920s and kind of played a very instrumental role in setting up what became the Agape Lodge, which Jack Parsons would later join, and which was the only active OTO body existing in the world at the point of Crowley's death. And so Jane Wolfe was absolutely instrumental to that, and there have been others as well. Jack Parsons' first wife, Helen Parsons Smith, and also Phyllis Seckler, who both of whom were involved within the Agape Lodge as well, and who were really essential to kind of preserving and helping to reestablish the OTO in the US. So, and this, I feel like this doesn't get said enough also, because there's this kind of pervasive narrative, like when we talk about theosophy and we talk about spiritualism and we talk about the Golden Dawn, we say that women were really empowered in those movements. And there's this pervasive narrative around Crowley, which says that he was a massive sexist and that he exploited and destroyed all of the women in his life.
I was just about to ask you that, so I'm happy that you're covering it.
Yeah. And that's, I think that narrative is really unhelpful. And it's also a pretty serious misrepresentation of the reality. And it's one of those narratives that kind of wants to masquerade as feminist. And I actually find it quite the opposite, because a lot of the time the narrative around women like Rose Kelly, Crowley's first wife, or Leah Hersig, his most influential Scarlet Woman in the 1920s, is that they were kind of drawn in by Crowley, who then exploited and destroyed them. And it doesn't do these women any favors, and it's not historically accurate either. What we can see for the historical Thelemic movement, much as it was for Theosophy or for the Golden Dawn, is that most of the women who were drawn to Crowley were unconventional in their own right, of course, because otherwise they wouldn't be drawn to this sort of movement. They were, a lot of them were sort of quite close to this idea of the new woman, which was popular in certain branches of feminism in the early 20th century. So there were people who worked for a living, who got married late or not at all, who had children outside of marriage, who had many lovers, who traveled, who studied, who smoked cigarettes and wore trousers and rode bicycles and all of these things, and who went back to doing so after being with Crowley. So this narrative of Crowley and his poor exploited women is, for me, it's extremely unhelpful, and it doesn't accurately represent how these women actually lived their lives, and most of whom went back to having very long lives with other lovers and other marriages and other forms of spiritual and occult practice in different ways. All of that being said, we do have fewer preserved writings that are sort of a theological nature or pertaining to magical theory by early women Thelemites than by their male contemporaries. And I think there might be several reasons for this. One of the reasons is, in some cases, we know the sources have simply been lost. There are a lot of writings by Leah Hersing which appear not to have survived. So that's one factor. Another factor is that I think in some ways that the early Thelemic movement was also a product of its time. So I think that there are certain things to suggest that the women in the movement were expected to take on a larger share of kind of the day-to-day organizational stuff. So the cooking and the shopping and the child rearing and the finances, and not maybe the same expectation that they would produce large quantities of kind of theoretical or theological writing. So I think that was kind of a factor as well. And I think looking at the historical role of women in Thelema, it's important to acknowledge both of those things, both that all of those sort of day-to-day, the cooking and the child rearing and the finances, I mean, that's absolutely instrumental to making a religious movement function, and seeing those as less worthy things to be spending one's time with. That's kind of, that carries a gender bias of its own, I think. But also, on the other hand, that there was potentially this inequality as well, and part of which was just caused by the roles of women in society at that time as well, who were more vulnerable to, of course, to unwanted pregnancies, and who didn't have access to safe and reliable contraceptives or abortion care, or all of the things that we do today. So all of those things were factors, and yeah. So all of that being said, again, I mean, Crowley was very sort of all over the spectrum in his views on women, or really any given group in his writings. Sometimes he writes things that are feminist, even by today's standards. Sometimes he writes things that by today's standards are hugely sexist. And sometimes he writes things that are just petty and mean. And that's not only towards women, that's towards any given group of people, really. Yeah. So many different things. I don't think that Crowley, I think it's important to distinguish between Crowley as a writer and kind of what was the lived reality of the early Thelemic movement, where women have always been important. And of course, I mean, looking at Thelema today, that is very much still the case. But what we've also seen, as I've mentioned over the last few decades, is that writers who are not men, who are women, who have been stepping into that space of producing and circulating writings, and some of them around Babalon, or the idea of the Scarlet Woman, but also around Thelemic magical practice in general, and writings by women achieving much wider circulation. And many of these women writers also critique Crowley for what they see as sexism in his work, and also look quite critically at the historical roles of women in the Thelemic movement, and kind of develop their own understandings of Thelemic magical practice from the perspective of feminine embodied experience. So that's also something that's been happening in recent decades, but definitely magnified in certain ways in the last few years. So I think that's important to say as well.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think that there is it is common, this misconception that Crowley and Thelema are misogynistic or against women, or they just exploit women. So
it's an interesting narrative, because it's strangely, and I mean, that's not to minimize the fact that Crowley was not always, I think, the most pleasant or easy of people to be around for men or for women. Like, he treated people quite appallingly at times, and that definitely goes for his male disciples as well. But this was especially like in the early 1920s when Crowley and Leah Herzig were running the Abbey of Thelema in Cefalù, Sicily. There was starting really in 1922, but then going forward, a lot of press circulating around the evil Aleister Crowley and his poor women that he has kind of lured into his spider's web of black magic and perverse rites. And
which also kind of assumes that women are, you know, these feeble,
gullible,
yes.
feeble-minded idiots, basically. Yeah. And I mean, we have the writings of the women from that period. So we have volumes and volumes of letters from Jane Wolfe, for instance, who was also in Cefalù during this period and was looking at this tabloid media portrayal and going, what? And basically, like the Sunday Express in the UK writing that Crowley forced his women to prostitute themselves on the streets of Palermo, and Jane Wolfe going, when did this happen exactly? Like it's very, I mean, it's funny, but it's also dreadful, and it parallels with I mean, around that time, I think also connected to these kind of anxieties around the transforming roles of women. There was also these anxieties around like alternative religious and spiritual movements, which were often a forum for like challenging gender roles and where women often could like hold positions of power in various ways. So there was this paranoia around I mean what we'd call new religious movements, but like in the 1920s, which and which kind of masqueraded as concern for the women, but was in fact quite often, I think, rooted in this fear that women would not marry and not enter into having many children and being the subservient and modest wife, but would actually travel around the world and have lovers and be unruly and be shameless and radical in various ways. So it's I mean, a lot of it was quite conservative in its way, I think, and still is.
Yeah, definitely. I'd also like to touch on the figure and role of the Scarlet Woman. Where this, you know, what is the Scarlet Woman and what's the history of this role and how it developed over time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So of course the Scarlet Woman, like Babalon, kind of originates in as a concept can be traced back to the Book of Revelation in some ways. And a Scarlet Woman, like in the 19th century, that was also used as a negative euphemism for a prostitute or for a sex worker. So like when Crowley used that term, it was in the context of a wider culture where that was very much a negative term again. But the Scarlet Woman appears in Crowley's writings for the first time in the Book of the Law, in Liber Alba Legis, where she is described as the kind of female counterpart or consort or sort of the feminine equivalent, basically, of the Beast 666, which was Crowley's self-chosen title. And it's said that the Scarlet Woman is to help the Beast in bringing about the new Aeon and bringing the teachings of the Book of the Law to the people, basically. And Crowley initially interpreted that title of the Scarlet Woman as a reference to his then wife, Rose Kelly, who was with him in Cairo in Egypt, where they were on honeymoon. When the Book of the Law was received, and she also, of course, played an instrumental role in the transmission of the Book of the Law by channeling instructions to Crowley for how to prepare and telling him to prepare to take dictation, which he then did, and which resulted in that text. And she also amended the text in a few small instances. So she played a really important role. So Crowley initially saw that as a reference to Rose, but their marriage disintegrated. So around 1909, when things had really sort of fallen apart between them, Crowley began interpreting the Scarlet Woman instead as a transferable office, referring to a woman who was his lover and his magical partner, and who quite often would help him with various forms of spirit communication or channeling messages from higher entities. So Rose Kelly brought Crowley, in Crowley's view, brought him into contact with the entity Aiwass, who dictated the Book of the Law. And later Scarlet Women also performed similar, acted in similar ways and channeled communications from other higher beings, as Crowley saw it. So the first woman to hold the title of Scarlet Woman after Rose Kelly was Mary Diesti, who was a cosmetics entrepreneur and who became Crowley's lover, and who channeled in 1911 a series of messages from the entity Abudis, and which resulted in the penning of Crowley's book 4, where like Mary Diesti is credited as co-author for parts of it, and then a series of other women, including but not limited to Jean Foster, who was a poet and a journalist and a fashion model, who was Crowley's lover briefly in 1915. Roddy Minor, who was a suffragette, and also, of course, Leah Herzig, who helped co-found the Abbey of Thelema in Sicily, and who was a school teacher and a teacher of music, and who was Crowley's, what I would argue to be, in terms of her impact within Thelema, Crowley's most influential Scarlet Woman, maybe with the possible exception of Rose Kelly, but Leah Herzig was definitely the one of Crowley's Scarlet Women who had the longest and deepest level of magical practice and involvement of her own, and kind of involvement in coordinating the Thelemic movement and acting as Crowley's emissary and assisting him in key writings, and she also did these things and channeled messages from Aiwass, but also from several of the other entities that the previous Scarlet Women had brought Crowley into contact with. So, and that's the view that he kind of sticked to for the remainder of his life, that the Scarlet Woman was a transferable office, but it referred to one person at a time. So Crowley kind of points to this succession of women who hold this title, and he also interpreted that title, of course, as referring to one who incarnated the force of Babylon on Earth. So after Crowley, we have Jack Parsons, who kind of conflates the Scarlet Women or the Scarlet Woman and Babylon quite significantly. So he refers to this divine feminine manifestation that he was trying to produce with Hubbard and Cameron in 1946 as Babylon, the Scarlet Woman. So that kind of becomes one person. But in one way, he also kind of interprets it, as I've mentioned, as potentially also kind of the name of a force that could be incarnate in anyone, and especially in liberated women. And then we have Kenneth Grant, who again sort of uses the words Scarlet Woman and Babylon interchangeably, but who was one of the earlier writers to interpret the Scarlet Woman not as one historical figure, nor as necessarily just a transferable office, but as a magical role that can be taken on by anyone who's female-bodied and who has the requisite level of magical skill. So Grant kind of rephrases the beast and the Scarlet Woman from these historical individuals to roles that can be taken on by any magical coupling, provided that they're sufficiently skilled. And that is more close to the way that the term Scarlet Woman is used by Thelemic magical practitioners and others in the contemporary occult milieu today, which is usually, if people are talking about the role of the Scarlet Woman in something other than in a historical sense, it's usually in the sense of this is a role, or this is kind of an archetype that can be assumed by any woman potentially, or any person regardless of gender, depending on who you'd ask, and which some people interpret as a magical role or a sex magical role, and others interpret as a more kind of everyday thing in the sense of representing being liberated in your sexuality, or being in touch with your sexual power, and all of these things. But definitely in the last few decades, it's been very, like in contemporary writings on the Scarlet, definitely a pervasive view is that it is something that can be claimed for oneself. It's not something that you need to have be bestowed upon you by another magical practitioner, much as it was during Crowley's lifetime, because during that time within the Thelemic movement, it was definitely him who kind of appointed and deposed the Scarlet Women, which we see very clearly in the case of Leah Hersig as well, because she wasn't necessarily comfortable with being deposed from that role when Crowley suddenly decided that he was going to take on a new Scarlet Woman. So that's something that's changed quite significantly.
And why does it have to be a woman? Why does the Scarlet Woman have to be a woman?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think in terms of Crowley's magical practice, that's just how he envisioned it, for various reasons. I mean, he obviously had male lovers as well who were extremely important to him for longer or shorter periods from a magical point of view. The chief of them, I think, being Victor B. Neuburg, but to my knowledge, he never referred to any of them as Scarlet Men. So I don't know. It's just the way that he envisioned it, I guess, which could be linked to this idea of divine gender polarity and the polarity of the masculine and the feminine divine, which plays a really important role in the Book of the Law and in Thelema, and that being represented on Earth by physical men and women. I mean, the way that Kenneth Grant writes about this role, it is, he writes about it quite clearly in terms of a specific reproductive anatomy, and emphasizing that men and women have different roles in sexual magic. And he links vaginal fluids and semen to very different things in this kind of sex magical interplay. So in Grant's writings, I mean, it's really an issue of his kind of take on I don't know, what we might call like magical chemistry, or just the way that these polarities work in practice. I think if we look at the contemporary esoteric milieu, there are a lot of people who would say that it doesn't have to be a woman, and that it's a role that can be claimed by anyone, regardless of gender, and that it's important to do so. And I know, like, one of the early essays written in that vein was by a female occultist named Linda Florio, who has also worked a lot in the kind of Kenneth Grantian Typhonian tradition. And this essay, I think it was published for the first time actually in the early 1990s. So that's one of the really sort of early, within a volume called Faces of Babylon, published by Black Moon and edited by Michelin Linden. So that was one of the, like, these early sort of writings, early 1990s volumes that I was talking about, that are on Babylon, but written by female identified magical practitioners. And in that essay, Linda Florio stresses that well, basically, we talk about this as a feminine energy, but the only thing that limits the energies that any magical practitioner can access is their own skill and imagination. And Florio uses gender-neutral pronouns throughout that essay, as I can recall. And there's also another essay in the same volume which talks about sex work and sacred prostitution in relation to Babalon and the Scarlet Woman, which also uses gender-neutral pronouns, as I can recall. So definitely lots of people that I've spoken to today would say that it doesn't have to be a woman. It doesn't have to be limited to any gender. I think what is quite significant though is I think that a lot of the time this role of the Scarlet Woman and like the need to identify with that role in one's own magical practice or one's own daily life, that need seems to be more sort of intensely felt among people who identify as women or who identify as femme. I think partly because of just the way that femininity is conceptualized in society, and the way that it has been more difficult for people who identify as women or femme to kind of inhabit that very sort of unrestrained sexual autonomy and power. So I will say that I've encountered very few cisgendered males who have like explicitly identified with the role of the Scarlet Woman, but I've encountered plenty of people of all other genders that do. So I also think it's partly an issue of just who finds that role more meaningful and spiritually sort of transformative, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and perhaps since it is linked to the figure of Babalon and that kind of reclamation of femininity or a different form of non-normative, conformist femininity, perhaps that might also play a role into the Scarlet Woman being associated with femininity.
Yes, I mean, there's definitely a very, I mean, and this is very much what my book is about. I think is important to say as well that, I mean, in terms of Crowley's writings as well, I mean, he links Babalon very clearly to femininity, but it's not always, that doesn't always mean a particular reproductive anatomy in his writings, because he sometimes kind of steps into that role and writes about himself as the whore dressed in scarlet who's sexually receptive and takes in and kind of steps into a feminine persona. And in Crowley's rendering of the Abyss ordeal, I mean, Babalon has kind of this dual role. She's partly this thing that's external to the self, which the adept sacrifices their individuality in order to unite with, but she's also the emblem of the spiritual magical attitude that's necessary to survive the abyss. So in one way, crossing the abyss successfully is kind of in Crowley's writings an emulation of that sort of feminine spiritual standpoint. And he also expresses this in the Book of Lies from 1911, where he says that I think I'm quoting the brothers of AA are women, the aspirants to AA are men, and he's talking about the magical order AA, and the brothers of AA in this phrase represent the people who are like who have fully undergone the crossing of the abyss and emerged on the other side, claiming the degree of masters of the temple. And of course, he's not talking about physical reproductive parts here. He's talking about how those who have undergone the crossing of the abyss have, in one sense, undergone kind of a feminization at the spiritual level by embracing this this receptive standpoint. So there's definitely, this link to femininity, but I think it's also important to say that womanhood and femininity are not the exact same thing, although of course they're linked. But yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah, thank you very much for clarifying that. Now I'd like to move on to a few questions from my patrons. Mm-hmm. The first two are from Andrew. So the first one is, Thelema gave birth to a number of daughter religions, but how is Thelema itself doing in the modern age? Is there a thriving movement mostly hidden from the public eye, or has it fractured into subgroups of which none is gaining a foothold amongst the myriad forms of 21st century paganism?
Oh, it's no, definitely still around and not very hidden, I think. So the two magical orders that Crowley utilized during his lifetime to promulgate Thelema, very much still around. The largest of them is Ordo Templi Orientis, which so Crowley became the British head of that in 1912, and eventually in the 1920s became the international head of it. And it was around for the rest of Crowley's life. It led a more or less dormant existence for a couple of decades after Crowley's death, and was reconstituted in the United States in 1969 by Grady McMurtry, aided by a few of the people that I mentioned earlier, so Helen Parsons Smith and Phyllis Seckler of the old Agape Lodge, among a few other important figures as well. And since then, essentially, OTO has kind of progressively grown slowly and steadily. So OTO today has about 4,000 members globally, and has been very successful in acquiring the copyrights to Crowley's works and putting out editions of Crowley's works also, and has a presence on all continents, basically, if not in all countries. And so 4,000 people, that is much larger than OTO was at any point during Crowley's lifetime, and actually makes it one of the larger, more formalized occult orders that are in existence today. So that's definitely very much still around. Crowley's AA is still around as well, though there's more. There's a few different groups that all claim descent from Crowley's AA, and that's a whole other issue. But that's definitely still around as well, and is not as large as OTO, and tends to be more personalized and more private. So OTO is more of a social order, and which actually does a lot of its activities publicly. So one of the things that the OTO does is organize Crowley's Gnostic Catholic Mass, which is celebrated in non-COVID times every week somewhere in the world, and most larger OTO bodies do it at least monthly. So and do a lot of reading groups and classes and workshops and social gatherings and other things publicly. So not at all hidden, really. The things that are hidden from the public in terms of OTO, one of the big things at least, is of course the initiation rituals, which are secret. But yeah, then like OTO and AA are definitely the big two in terms of Thelemic groups in the present day esoteric landscape. There are other smaller splinter groups as well, and new groups that have been formed of varying sizes, some of which are a handful of people, some are maybe a few dozen people. And then there are, of course, as the question asking patron brings up, of course, there are a lot of what we could call daughter religions, or kind of post-Thelemic groups as well, or solitary practitioners, or more or less loosely organized groups of practitioners who draw very strongly on some of Crowley's ideas and some aspects of the Thelemic tradition, but who are not kind of within orthodox Thelema, as we'd say. But yes, so definitely alive and vibrant in a lot of ways.
Thank you for answering that. I guess I was thinking of the of Italy, which is where I do my field work, and I was, thinking that the OTO is very much live and vibrant, as you said. Italy as well.
Yeah, definitely. No, definitely, very vibrant in Italy. Absolutely, yeah.
And the second question is that Andrew is asking is, looking into Thelema, I came across Nema and Andahadna. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her right, and her Maat Magick, which she developed from Crowley's ideas. Some writers laud her as being very influential in esoteric circles. Why have most like me never heard of her?
Well, yes, no, absolutely. She has been very influential. So Nema is one of those people that I might say is kind of one way that she could be described is in terms of this kind of post-Thelemic landscape of esoteric practitioners and authors and teachers. So she's been very influential, and she inspired Kenneth Grant, but she was also herself inspired by Grant's work in several ways. So she has been, I think, extremely formative in inspiring, again, kind of forms of esoteric practice and engagement that are kind of broadly informed by Crowley and Thelema, but take it in a novel direction. So she has been very influential, and I think also definitely as what we've been talking about as a female author who's been very sort of prolific and also active as a teacher and as an initiator. I think she's been extremely important. Can't speak to why the person asking the question hasn't heard of her. I think
that what he meant is that lots of people who are part of the practicing community don't really know of her. So he was wondering why her outreach hasn't been as influential among contemporary practitioners that are interested in or practice magic.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about Crowley and Thelema, Crowley does tend to sort of dwarf anyone else. So, because I mean, he was so prolific and he's such a big sort of author and personality in this milieu as well. But quite honestly, I'm not sure when the last time was that I walked into if not an occult section of a regular bookshop, but at least an occult or pagan bookshop that doesn't have a copy of Nema's Magick. It's usually there among the staples. So I would argue that a lot of people have heard of her. But I mean, of course, we could also I don't know if it's true in the case of Nema, but I mean, we could also bring gender into the discussion and say that as progressive as the occult milieu has often been in terms of there being space for women as leaders and organizers and initiating figures, the occult community definitely has not been immune to these kind of broader societal structures where women are not credited to the same extent for their work. So I don't know if that is the case with Nema, but I know it's definitely been the case with a lot of other female occult writers who have been very influential. So yeah.
Then we have one final question from Vocatus, and he's asking, I would be interested to know if there is connection with Pistis Sophia, and also is there any connection with the Babylonian goddess narrative and the biblical character in Ezekiel?
Right. So yes. So this kind of goes back to my previous point about methodological agnosticism. I'm not sure of the viewpoint from which this person is asking their question. So if we're looking at whether or not these entities are the same, I mean, that falls outside of what I'd be comfortable answering as a scholar. If we're looking at verifiable chains of textual transmission, or the transmission of ideas, the connection to Ezekiel would be such that definitely the book of Ezekiel was one of the largest sources of biblical inspiration for the book of Revelations. There are very clear parallels in language and in imagery. I'm also fairly sure that Crowley studied the book of Ezekiel quite keenly. I know I found a passage in Crowley's The Vision and the Voice, which is the visionary record of his Enochian experiments of 1909. And I believe, if I recall correctly, I know I found a passage there which refers to Babylon, and which has very clear linguistic parallels to the book of Ezekiel, with imagery that does not appear in the book of Revelation. So yes, like in terms of direct textual influence, I would say that there is that link. In terms of the Pistis Sophia, I'm actually not sure. That's a good question. I don't know. I'll have to look into that. That's really.
What if people want to reach out to you? Is there any place where people can find your work?
Yes. So yeah. So the easiest way to find my academic publications is at my academia.edu profile. If you Google my name, that comes up very, very quickly. On Facebook, I have a Facebook page called the Thelemic Women's History Project, which is centered on the research that I've been doing for my postdoc, which has explored some of the women in Thelema in the 20th century, one of them being Leah Hersig, another one of them being Jane Wolfe, whom we've talked about. And I'm also on Instagram and on Twitter, slightly more active on Instagram, both under the handle Dr._Scarlett Woman. And yes, so you're very welcome to follow me there and to reach out if there are questions about anything.
So thank you so much, Manon, for doing this interview. I found it very fascinating. It was quite thought-provoking, and there were a few points that I will have to sort of revisit and explore further in my own research as well.
Well, thank you, Angela. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure, and yeah, I'm just delighted to be on your channel, and thank you also to those who have listened to this.
Indeed. Let us know in the comments what you think about what we said. So this is it for today's video. What do you think about what we discussed? Let me know in the comment section. You know that I always look forward to reading what you think. And of course, if you did like this video, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell so that you will never miss a new upload from me. Share my content around, it really helps us grow. And thank you so much for being here. and stay tuned for all the academic fun. Bye for now.